It's true we have a gentleman's agreement. But unfortunately, I am no gentleman.
This is How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's January 1919, and Fran Hoepfner joins us today to discuss MEYER from Berlin. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, or just to say hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome, Fran Hoepfner. Do you want to tell our audience and myself, what do you do and what made you interested in coming on to a podcast episode for a director that's been dead for 75 years and, moreover, one of his most obscure, only available on YouTube and potato quality movies?
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm Fran Hoepfner. I'm a writer in just about every regard, but I do a lot of cultural criticism and pop cultural journalism. I've been a film critic with Bright Wall Dark Room and The Wrap for a while, and a film essayist. And, I wanted to come onto this podcast. I'm sort of newly into Lubitsch, having worked my way through much of the filmography of Billy Wilder. And I think there kind of is no Billy Wilder without Ernst Lubitsch. And sometime around the holidays last year, I finally watched Shop Around the Corner, which was my first Lubitsch and maybe his most famous one, in part because it inspired You've Got Mail so directly. And since then, I've maintained a bit of a fascination that lay dormant while exploring other directors' filmographies that have been long overlooked in my own viewing. But I was actually, at the time you reached out, I was in the midst of having just seen and working on an essay about Design for Living, a film that for years people told me I would love because of how funny and interesting and sexually revolutionary it was for its time. And it just made me really curious about more Lubitsch films. And as far as the obscurity of this one, I sometimes think the more obscure or unexpected, the better. I'm always happy to get out of my comfort zone with a viewing experience, especially older comedies, silent comedies. I was just really kind of compelled by it, and I remain compelled and baffled by it in equal measure. I'm really excited to talk about MEYER from Berlin.
It's interesting kind of jumping then from the 30s and 40s. It's interesting seeing him kind of bash his style into being.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how long it took Lubitsch to form that kind of ineffable tragicomic style that we all associate with him, the touch. And this is a film that I think, might be lacking in some of those areas. So MEYER from Berlin, basically, let's be real here. It's the Adam Sandler holiday film of the Lubitsch retrospective. It's a film in which our favorite character ever, Sally, now named Sally Meyer. We've seen this character before in Shoe Palace Pincus, in which Lubitsch played Sally Pincus, a shoe entrepreneur. In this one, there's no more shoes, but he is now a city slicker from Berlin. Very similar character, very lecherous character, who goes on a hiking trip to the Bavarian Alps to regain his health, and hijinks ensue as he is a sex pest.
Watching this film, I thought back to a text message I got from a friend probably a decade ago who was reading the first novel by a novelist that she and I both really enjoy. She texted me in all caps, like late in the middle of the night, like, I'm reading so-and-so's first novel and it sucks, with a bunch of exclamation points. And I think it was this kind of cathartic realization for me at the time, being a young artist, being like, oh, the first thing you do and make, or even the first couple of things, even if you have the money and the financing or then the publishing rights or whatever the medium is, it might be really bad, especially compared to what's to come. I don't know if I think MEYER from Berlin is really bad, but I thought it was illuminating and cathartic and refreshing to see something that's just not there yet in terms of Lubitsch's style and sense of humor. He's playing really broad and obvious, and a character that I think embodies a lot of like internalized, perhaps anti-Semitism in Lubitsch. I don't know. It's great to see him knowing that he manages to reel it all back in and to, at some point, get to a point that's quite artful and beautiful in his later comedies. But plenty to admire about this film, especially in its just like production design, and that they were shooting, if not in the Alps, then on mountainsides or out in the wilderness. Like, I was quite stunned, I think, by the quality of its production.
Yeah, it's interesting because the controversy around the Sally and kind of this archetype that Lubitsch played repeatedly, if any listeners want to hear a kind of conversation about that and haven't yet, Dara Jaffe and I went pretty deep on this in episode 2. It's still a matter of significant debate, this question of, is this character, as Lubitsch would put it, kind of he would say a Jewish in-joke. He would call it ethnic humor, right? Or can it be viewed through that, lens of anti-Semitism? And that's still highly unresolved. Not something I'm probably personally qualified to draw conclusions on, neither historically or experience-wise.
It was sort of compelling just as a Jewish person, because I had seen some reviews be like, very anti-Semitic, this is anti-Semitic. I was kind of familiar with the Sally Meyer character as this like anti-Semitic stereotype. I have to imagine there are other Meyer films that are maybe engaging more in like the urban life of a Jewish guy in Berlin. But this, I don't know if this struck me as any more anti-Semitic than it is just like, this character's a lech. I don't really see it as tied to his Judaism necessarily, other than perhaps Lubitsch looked like kind of an ethnic stereotype of a Jewish man. I don't know if I particularly think so, but I don't know who was saying what at the time. I just think, even in reading about like contemporary anti-Semitism, like the issues with that come with like issues of privilege and whiteness, and it's clear to me regardless of that this character is someone who like gets away with stuff.
The first time we've seen this kind of archetype was actually in Where's My Treasure or Where Now He's Dead, 2 different titles, in which Lubitsch plays pretty much this character, except his name is Ernst Lubitsch inside the movie. He's actually playing a character named after himself, and it's kind of interesting trying to kind of suss out, okay, who is this comic persona and how does it differ from Ernst Lubitsch the person too? Because one kind of refrain I've found throughout this is 100 years ago, like 103 years ago when this film was made, there was that kind of archetype of, the man of the house who, especially, you see at the beginning harassing his assistant or his maid. And yet how much of that feels personal for Lubitsch in the sense of Simon Lubitsch, his father, was apparently in this general genre of behavior in a way that Lubitsch, as far as we know, never was. So I always wonder how much he's kind of taking cues from that in these roles and how much of it is just the expectations of what this kind of satirical persona would entail circa 1919 in this case.
Yeah, I'm curious to know who is supposed to be laughing at this. Like, is this punching up or is this punching down? Are his friends amused by this? I have to imagine so. I don't know that he would go so far to be so goofy and debase himself as such if this wasn't making, his peers, especially the Jewish ones, also laugh. But it's genuinely hard to say if this is like an act of, I want to say, like, not necessarily business desperation, whatever it is to get himself off the ground into the film world. So hopefully he can do something a little less base. I think you see this with filmmakers all the time now, especially in comedy. You see like really great comedy directors and writers doing punch-ups or directing gigs on movies that are terrible and broad and disgusting and gross in order to hopefully one day get the money to do something better. But I wonder to what extent this is like an organic creation versus a business necessity.
At the time, too, before he truly became a big deal internationally for his historical epics, this character was his kind of calling card. He was most famous as an actor playing the Sally archetype. So that's very interesting to think of the turn he took, where his brand, 10 years later, his brand was the lightest touch, the champagne fizziness, which is incredibly absent here in this broadness of this very base archetypical character.
It feels like Sandler in that sense, where it's like you go to an Adam Sandler movie, you pull one up on his Netflix deal or something, you know what you're getting. And for the fans of Sally, this is expected.
Yeah, it's like going on vacation with your favorite, comic character, right? It's interesting because I think this is one of the films I was most at a loss as to what to latch onto here. Even by the standards of his films at this time, it's a very simple film, right? It's City Slicker plays hooky so he can get away from his wife, and go, one, on a mountaineering trip that he is horribly underprepared for, and two, chase especially this one society lady in particular that he latches onto, who keeps him around as more of a amusement and to ward off the other, in her mind, more seriously dangerous men.
You know, I thought a lot about hotel culture as kind of a thing of the past. It's funny that we have the success of something like The White Lotus, which is kind of about what a lot of older films and television shows were about, which is like the hotel as this like big social place and also this social leveling ground, so to speak, that this is where you met people both within your bubble, outside your bubble. Now I think of hotels as like quite separated and stale to some extent. Like I don't know who's sitting with or who's staying on the same floor as me, and I'm not talking to people I don't know at the continental breakfast. That's not why I'm there. But it used to be this really social action, and I think of like the livelihood of the dining room in the hotel, not only for Sally but for everyone else there. And I was like, we really don't have a thing like this anymore. All of which I think also like plays into, I think, some facet of Jewish culture and like, you know, the nature of like what the Catskills were in the 50s and 60s. Obviously that comes later, but I thought a lot about that while watching. The Catskills became this like vacation haven for Jews in the post-World War II era, where people would come up and all stay at these certain hotels or cabins and rent them all together. You know, like Dirty Dancing is essentially set in one of these like Catskills resorts. And they were also always like filled with their own entertainment, their own music, their own comedians. You hear about like Borscht Belt, Catskill-style Jewish comedians being these really hokey, obvious, broad comedians. I think the best example of this, if you've seen Wet Hot American Summer, Michael Showalter doing comedy at the talent show towards the end of the film is kind of like the most base, obvious version of that. And I think one of the funniest parts of that movie, but I almost think of Lubitsch as one of these like proto Catskills Jewish comedians.
I mean, I think this is the last kind of hurrah of, at least as far as surviving films. Everything I have to asterisk of like, there's like the 20 films that we don't have. This is the last hurrah of that specific vein of humor in his films. I think it's also no coincidence that this is the last time he would play this character and the last time this character would appear in his work at all. There's a gap between this humor here and everything he did after this that I wonder what happened to that. Like, is it something where he was in a rush to move away from it?
I was curious about that too, and just like why hang up this character, perhaps besides the obvious reason of not that funny, not that compelling, not that smart, not that formally interesting. But if this is a character he was like, I'm sick of doing this, I don't want to do this anymore, this is obvious, or if because greater opportunities got in the way of this.
I mean, within 9 months, Madame Dubarry had come out, and his career is never the same. So I think he had the full ability to say goodbye to anything he didn't want to do from then on. You've
seen, I think, more of Lubitsch's work than I at this point. What is your impression of him as an actor and as a performer? I found that very compelling and frustrating at times.
Well, I'll keep my thoughts short because I'm much more interested in your thoughts on that. Because,
okay. Fair enough.
Because having now seen all of Lubitsch's extant performances, of which there are 4, I don't think he was ever a great actor. And I think that his films noticeably improved when he found people to, even when he's not going for that, our favorite, champagne fizziness, people who could at least play the broad with more dexterity, like someone like Ossie Oswalda in I Don't Want to Be a Man, which she plays the Lubitsch type in terms of tone, but shades it with so much more of a character you can grab onto and more like genuine irreverence. You root for her because she's actually fighting against something. Oswalda is so good at playing that. She's so good at playing someone who's simultaneously extremely immature, but also kind of a bit smarter than everyone else in the room. And I don't get that shading from Lubitsch, even in I think his best role is in Sumerin. He's still, again, one of the weaker performances in that film.
He was so interesting to watch. I mean, I also don't think he's a particularly good actor. He's mugging. He's really playing. It made me sort of wonder about his directing style with actors later on. If he gains a sort of subtlety when he's behind the camera, or on the flip side, like a kind of offhand approach that allows people who are geniuses to just be geniuses. I found myself so curious to know whether this kind of hamminess gets transposed behind the scenes, or if it's just a matter of maturity, if it's just someone who gets tired of playing big and broad and dumb.
It's interesting seeing that kind of slowly, at least as far as Lubitsch goes, evolve. Where, I mean, 2 years after this, you have someone like Henny Porten playing, in the case, a dual role, actually. She's incredible in Cole Heisey's Daughters. And there's so much more nuance there, and she's not playing to the cheap seats. I tie so much of what went on in early silent cinema to what was going on in theater stages, right? Because there's no such thing as a close-up on a theater stage.
Yeah, totally.
Your performance gets communicated not by hand waving like I'm doing off camera right now, but your performance gets communicated with these big broad strokes by necessity. And I mean, the camera follows suit, right? I mean, so much of this film, there's like, how many close-ups are in this movie? There's probably single digits. So it all feels very tailored to that large hand type performance.
I admire it, if only because I think now sometimes films that should play broad and big feel too low energy. I'm sort of like, well, you know, he brought a real sense of spirit to this. You got to give it up. Congrats to anyone who wrote a book, Heidi Montag tweet or whatever. But it does feel like a real overbearingness on this film, which is otherwise, I think I was remarking to my partner, like stretching to hit that like 57-minute mark in terms of plot.
And yet it seems in such a rush to get out. There is I truly don't know whether this is a byproduct of the ends of reels, being the most damaged, but there's a habit of Lubitsch films in this period of just ending abruptly. 5 frames after the conflict is resolved, it's end. And I mean, in Madame Dubarry, they lost the ending, for example. So I always wonder, like, was there another shot in there? But it's so languorous, this film, other than the ending.
I mean, I gotta say, I admire a quick ending. Now I think also we suffer from like giving a movie like 6 endings. But it was funny to see, like, I mean, I think even in the indulgence of the character, there is a brevity and a lightness in touch with like the edit. It is languorous at times, but I don't think you're ever like sitting in one particular scene too long, which is often an issue with comedy, is knowing when to get out on the laugh. I think he's doing that on like a moment to moment basis pretty well. It's just that there's not that much going on. There's
no kind of complexity to the humor where you have moments where there is a single joke and then there is a break and then there is another joke instead of this kind of interweaving of tones. There are some, I think, fun one-liners in this. Like, I mean, most of them, I think, are unfortunately tied to his lechery, but sometimes his lechery is delivered in an amusing way. I quite liked the exchange in the train carriage where this is a lady's car. Well, that's why I came in. I thought, oh, that's interestingly fun and transgressive.
Yeah, those girlies love it. They're really having a laugh about it. That's sort of the thing about his lechery, is like, he is quite lecherous, but it does seem like, at least some of the time, it's working.
He's weirdly rakish in that way. Yeah, and there's that mixed signal in this where he seems to be diegetically attractive, even though there are absurd number of moments when he is the largest pig in the world. It almost feels like that same logic of like, I mean, we could tie it to like the Rob Schneiders, Adam Sandlers of the world, where they are simultaneously, or even like Groucho Marx actually, where it's simultaneously a repellent archetype who is just the magnet of all women in this case.
I work part-time at Gawker, and we just did this big comedy week. And our writer, Sarah Hakey, talked to Broti Gupta and Dylan Galula, 2 comedians I think are so funny. And they talk a lot about Rodney Dangerfield not getting any respect from his wife aspect of Dangerfield's comedy. And they brought up something that they sort of jokingly, but I think also quite astutely, called like the Dangerfield paradox, which is that like so much of his comedy is about this complicated relationship between his wife. But they're like, if you're Dangerfield's wife, you probably have a great time. You're laughing so much. He's so funny. Like, how do you not sort of love being an object in that way?
The way that the relationships between the genders in this film manifests does back that up, where it's not Lubitsch or Sally chasing Kitty that brings them together or forces them to be together. She is choosing to spend her time with this pest of a man for her own reasons. It is her agency that keeps the plot going, at least. There's never a sense that she is like this fool who's getting the wool pulled over her eyes. She's always 2 steps ahead of Sally. So there at least is that dynamic that I think is, it's still a film about a sex pest. But the best way to put this is I think that Kitty comes across quite well.
Yeah, totally. She seems to more than welcome it. We don't really know why she would welcome it versus not.
To ward off the flocks of suitors.
Yeah, I suppose to set up to have him be a line of defense. Yeah, she certainly comes off well. I think, that's it, but that's also like, that character could be anything. The fact that we even get to like see her write letters feels like almost like unearned depth in this case.
I'd forgotten about the fact that we see her letter writing, and she has her own full side plot with her husband, Harry.
But she doesn't even it's not like she hates Harry. She's just happy to take on any external attention where it can be found.
To that kind of flock of suitors, it's an interesting kind of through line we can see between this film and other films of this. I mean, I think all of Lubitsch's movies is that he loves arranging groups of mostly men and women one at a time as single entities. So there's this quite fun scene where Kitty is kind of being basically chased by 6 or 7 identically dressed, identical looking guys. These like evening coats, I think. That kind of arrangement of people is something that we're going to see exploded in the next film. But it's interesting to see it kind of here in a very small scale to at least highlight Kitty and Sally's individuality against these flocks. To the way this film feels kind of half-formed, I think it's also important to keep in mind that, this is one of, four films from the year 1919 that survive even. There's more that don't survive. I think this is probably the weakest of the 4. This whole kind of era of his career, he hadn't quite settled upon that specific tone that he would use to such great effect in his Hollywood films, where you can't really say whether they're a comedy or a drama. They're a little bit of both. They have this mastery of tone to them, but that still left room for him to do some incredible broad comedies. And The Oyster Princess is like the best version of that, where it's a film that pulsates with this rhythm. I mean, half the film is a dance scene. Again, very broad satire of, in this case, American industrialists, but it's a grand satire where everyone is just playing Looney Tunes characters, and the form of the film starts to actually keep up, where the pace of the edits, the rhythm, the use of split screen is just off the charts. It's incredible. But in this case, it's really wild to see this 6 months earlier.
I was thinking about what is effectively funny here, and you mentioned a bit like the dichotomy between Sally and some of the other men at the hotel. And I think this is putting a lot of stock, and not incorrectly, I'll say, on how funny it is to be in one of those little Bavarian outfits, as well as burdened with rope. That he just looks like a different guy from all of those guys. It has a kind of Mr. Bean effect in a way, where like no matter where Mr. Bean is, you're gonna be able to find him in a crowd because he always looks different. It's a very obvious laugh point, but it's an effective one too, that he's always overburdened. He's never wearing the right thing. When like the sad clown kind of emerges, that often winds up being its most effective comedic point, which is so simple and not very, narratively complex or comedically complex, but it's sometimes effective.
You never sympathize with him, I think, but
no,
the film carries you along with this person who has clearly ignorant of any culture outside of his own. And even when it comes to, somewhere that is 100 miles away, not even, it's not a big lift for him. He goes and assumes that this community is going to be this like rustic place where, you wear lederhosen and a giant, the biggest feather in world history in your cap. And you fit in when, he goes there and it's just a bunch of like kind of urbane society people all over again. He is in his day-to-day life probably pretty similar to those people, but because he has made himself a fish out of water because of his ignorance, he sticks out like a sore thumb.
Yeah, absolutely.
The way that this film interfaces with the kind of reality of Sally is interesting too, where there's a kind of repeated refrain in the film where he'll do something that is clearly outside of the diegetic reality. Like, for example, when the doctor finally prescribes the trip, right, to the mountains, Sally is, playing sick the whole time, but then immediately he jumps out of his bed and goes, yes, I agree with the doctor, right? Let's take that moment seriously as a piece of constructed reality. His wife would immediately go, whoa, this is ridiculous. You're not sick at all. You're jumping out of bed. But she doesn't notice, and it isn't kind of played as she somehow missed it. It's played as almost this extra diegetic thing, right? It's this action that exists kind of outside the world of the fiction of the movie. I found that interesting how Sally as a character in all these films, but I think especially this one, kind of exists both diegetically and outside of the world of the film simultaneously.
Yeah, well put. I thought initially I have like a extremely elementary ability to like read German. I often cannot understand it when spoken to me, and I'm miserable at speaking it, but I'm an okay reader of it. So it was fun to kind of try to keep up with the subtitles and the labeling. But initially, upon starting the film, when it's about, you know, Sally's sickness or lack thereof, when his wife is giving him, I think it's like ricinus oil. I don't know why. I thought she was dosing him with ricin, and I was like, okay, he's escaping his wife who's actively poisoning him and killing him. So this is like, so Sally is a victim of like a harpy wife who wants him dead, and only looked up later that this is sort of like the formal name for what we consider to be castor oil.
We couldn't have that. Then the film would have stakes.
I know. But I was like, wow, this is like kind of dark, like escaping your wife who wants you dead. And I can't wait to learn what he did.
This does get at something about this era that has been on and off a struggle, which is that, one, I don't speak German. I've picked up a few words over the past 3 months, but just purely due to osmosis, but I cannot speak it. I have no faculty. Two, a lot of these translations are terrible. A lot of the versions. For Carmen, actually, I had to use like the Google Lens feature on my phone and take photos of every title card and auto-translate, which led to some very funny moments. And so it can be really hard to, and even then, so much of this comedy, especially this movie, more than all the others, is steeped in specific 100-year-old German cultural customs. Like, I bet this film would be funnier if I had spent a decade in like Bavaria in the 1910s. I guess it wouldn't be funny because I'd have to suffer through the war, but anyway.
Yeah.
If I had been outside of that or just experienced that in a perfect world. And so it can be so difficult to fully interface with what this film is getting at. Like, who is this, it's what you said, right? It's who is this film for? Who is it satirizing? And what societal purpose? And I don't mean like message type. I mean, just what need is this film filling? It can be tough to empathize with that 103 years later.
At least with like the Sandler ones, they're often so dense with his friends and comedic partners that you're able to kind of get a justification just out of volume of who's on screen. So it's not like this one guy has to get away. It's all these guys have to get away, or all these guys have to, go to the Wild West and do Wild West stuff. But when it's just one guy, when it's a cast and a plot that's so narrow and so simple, it does get to be like, what is the point? But the form, the form is still expanding. No one had ever seen a guy fake sick and go to the mountains before 1919. Maybe they had, but that's sort of what it feels like. Like, I guess we have to get this out of the way.
I have a similar feeling actually to his big historical epics. I actually just recently had the largest crisis of enthusiasm for this whole project I've had so far. It was going to happen, and I think I'm over it. I watched Madame Du Barry, Sue Maroon, and Anna Boleyn in a row. And they are all, in my opinion, fairly turgid historical biopics, right? Well, like, it's Sue Maroon's a legend. It's Arabian Nights, but it's still turgid. And I was like, oh my God, have I lost the plot here? This is boring as shit. And it's the same struggle, though. These films were all hits, especially Madame Du Barry. That made his career. Yet I watched them and I'm like, this film does nothing for me. But if you cast your mind back to 1919, 1920, these films, no one had seen anything like them. No one had seen a biopic about Madame Du Barry before, done with all the lushness and everything. It's just that 2022, this film does not have a need it is serving in the same way as, like The Oyster Princess, which is hilarious.
Yeah, now we're so rich in films, good, bad, thin, thick, that this feels just truly, we've lived through several ebbs and flows of Dudes Rock, especially ones where it's like Dudes Rock actually in parentheses and Dudes Rock not actually in parentheses.
I wonder if, when I rewatch all these movies in like 20 or 30 years or whatever, whether certain films will come around to feeling relevant again when they aren't. Who knows?
It's hard to say.
I was looking forward to this one because in the Scott Amon book, he cites it as, this is a bright point in this era. And I wonder does it flourish on like 35 mil lovingly?
Oh,
lovingly
yeah.
Or something, because the version we have watched, I will say, is potato quality. It is YouTube, and that's the best version of it.
I mean, YouTube is such a profoundly strange platform, but that you can find, I watch Design for Living on YouTube. Not in amazing quality, slightly sped up, which was sort of hilarious. It's amazing to me that you can have people who like make millions of dollars like decorating cupcakes, and you can also have an extremely unofficial library of one of the most important filmmakers, essentially side by side.
Yeah, it's interesting where on the even the website for this podcast, where I've tried to link all the public domain works, almost everything is on YouTube.
Yeah.
I don't think this project would work without YouTube. And yet it's so tenuous, right? All those could be taken down tomorrow.
I don't know. I grew up like using like Mega Video to watch stuff like in the UK. And so I'll take kind of anything of any quality.
I wanted to take a detour to talk about the film's form, because there's a couple of specific things that I found very interesting. One is the day for night, that I don't know if you had the same struggle that I did in the film's climax, where in the cabin, it is impossible to figure out when the film was taking place, because when Lubitsch and Kitty are in the cabin, it is clearly night has fallen. They're trying to go to sleep. And yet without any assistance from light sources, Lubitsch's wife and Harry are making their way up the trail, and it is clearly photographed during the day. And it got me thinking, what time is it? And then that got me thinking about the contract with the audience that is cinematic night, right? Where day for night is just, it's the thing you do in the 1910s, 1920s, and up to today. I mean, look at Nope. It's the thing you do when you want to shoot wide shots outdoors and make it look like night. It never is convincing on a objective, like, does this actually look like moonlight level? But what it does is it interfaces with audience's understanding of what dark is. And it's kind of a contrast, right? It's a suspension of disbelief. And a film like this goes so far beyond that. So you have both nonsensical night diegetically, and also I always suspect that when day for night doesn't work in a film of this vintage, it's because this is an untinted copy. This version we're watching is black and white, and I wonder if this was intended to have had, for example, a dark, deep blue tint, which you can see in something like Rosita during the nighttime scenes, and whether that would have paved it over. Anyways, that was one interesting formal quirk of the film where I think, okay, is this a matter of the copy we're watching? Or is it a matter of the film just, circa 1919, had Lubitsch and Theodore Sparkle, had they cracked the code of night yet, like Lubitsch had clearly done circa Rosita? Or was it just a case of the audiences at that point, it's almost like video game night, right? Where it's just something that you don't think about too much.
Yeah. I have to admit that's where I kind of came into it, where if I see someone lying down in a bed and putting their covers on, it could be lit in any possible way. I think they're going to bed. And I'm willing to kind of step into that world of disbelief. At times it got hard to kind of remember how much time had passed and was passing. It's like all kind of over a weekend, essentially, is what it seems. I think that's another ways in which, like, the score is certainly helping the film feel more robust in a sensory way, but I think the relative monotony of the score, although music I certainly enjoyed, makes it really hard to determine pacing. It's all moving more or less at the same tempo, and it's hard to ascribe, okay, this is hours later, this is days later.
It also kind of harps on the same central comedic theme throughout most of it, and I quite like the theme. I think it's a fun melody. It got stuck in my head all last night after I rewatched this, but it does kind of make all the moments blend together when there's no dynamics in either the pacing or the melody.
Although absolutely,
it's far from the worst. Unfortunately, my favorite film from this whole era, which is The Doll, has by a wide margin the worst score. So I had to throw on some Mozart while watching that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I suppose I could have like picked my own as well. I mean, I'm a huge fan of like loose kind of like vaudeville jazz piano or ragtime piano, which I think gets derided a lot as like quite annoying, like ice cream truck style music. I find it really pleasant incidental music, but what's engaging about that type of music, I think, in played experience and a live experience, is that it plays quite fast and loose with its tempo in a way that allows it to become surprising. But when it's set to something that has as rigorous kind of a scene to scene rhythm, then it's hard to actually be having fun with the form as I otherwise would.
It's interesting the way that all these elements that the filmmakers could have no control over because we're watching it 100 years later play into our experiences, right? Like, imagine if we had watched this with like the greatest Carl Davis score ever. Like, imagine if Carl Davis had gone like, this is my life's work, this score. I'm going to make this the greatest masterpiece ever. Would we like it more? Who knows? One other element that stuck to me was the classical continuity, the idea of, okay, especially the Hollywood idea that most of pop cinema nowadays is based off of and has been for, decades and decades. It was still and Lubitsch being one of the chief architects of that when he went over to Hollywood. At this point, we can see that it's still I don't want to say it's in its infancy because it implies an inevitability to it, but Lubitsch is working in a different world here. And I found it interesting how in this film that also applied to the kind of the lack of continuity applies to kind of the way that spaces are linked together. I want to ask you, if you were asked to draw a layout of the hotel, could you?
Almost certainly not. And I'm also coming at this from a disadvantage of struggling with that to begin with. Like, I don't know that I could draw my own apartment if given.
Did you notice the weirdness of the hallway that leads into his apartment, or not his apartment, his hotel room? How it's impossible physically?
No, I didn't.
If you look at whenever Sally opens his hotel room door, there is a wall on the backside. You can see that there is a corridor looking thing. And then if you see the reverse, where that corridor was is gone. And there has been replaced on the other side, another corridor leading out to a hotel lobby that does not match what we saw. And again, I'm not going to be like movie mistakes, cinema sins, but I find interesting how, one, I think Kurt Richter did not work on this film, his kind of usual production designer. So I wonder if he would have caught that. But two, I do think it speaks to the fast and loose way this film and this era of films for Lubitsch plays with continuity, where the contract, the suspension of disbelief was not the same as it would have been 5 years later. And I found that fascinating how, this is just okay. It doesn't call attention to itself. I don't want to room 237 this hotel or
yeah.
This hallway doesn't lead. So therefore it's about the moon landing. I don't know. The scenes were more interesting to me in a lot of ways than the text. Even the axial cutting of this film where the camera will cut in on the same axis, the way that the hotel is laid out in a patently nonsensical way, the way that day for night, it doesn't behave the way we've been taught. And even like the way that the mountain summit is clearly a tiny outcropping that they shot upwards at. It gives it this small handmade quality.
This is where I often struggle with silent films, not because it takes necessarily more patience to watch, but the cutting between the scene and the dialogue when I'm really just trying to look at how a scene is laid out, how it's presented, and that back and forth will sometimes disrupt my focus. So something like noticing that like a hallway does not exactly line up with like the physics of a room. It's like my eyes are pulled in so many different directions that I'm often incapable of narrowing focus in such a way. And that's something that I think is also a side effect of, silent film viewing, is just not making up a significant fraction of my viewing experience. And I think, the more that I continue to explore and watch, the easier it becomes to understand how to view it in the medium I would any other film. But yeah.
But for me, kind of the simultaneous challenge and interest of silent films goes even deeper too, where it's because there wasn't such a rigorously adhered to standard of representation, that the breadth, the standard deviation of what you see in mainstream silent films is absolutely wild. There was no common language at this point. Or at least much less of one. So when you watch a film like this, it's almost like watching a film from a different era than what the Americans were doing. I'm amazed we've managed to wring so much discussion out of this film because it was what like my notes on like Madame Dubarry are like 5 pages. My notes on this were like a leaflet. Are there any kind of moments or films that Lubitsch has done that stick in your mind as like definitive of him as an artist? I'm curious about your own experience with his cinema and what sticks out to you as, this got me.
I think one of the things I so admire about his touch, and I recognize that he's not really necessarily writing a lot of the Golden Age films, but as comedies, I really appreciate how not didactic they are and how otherwise specific they remain. They don't become this like universal diatribe on ideas of love or how relationships work. Design for Living, I think, being just an amazing, like, quintessential example. Obviously, that's an adaptation of this, like, Noel Coward play, though they futz with it way more than Coward would have wanted them to. But, I mean, that film and that story is about those three specific people making their very or relatively unorthodox relationship work for them without saying, like, this is how you should solve your problems or this would work for everyone. But these characters feel so specifically rooted in this 3-person relationship and in these dynamics of affection with each other that you do find yourself rooting essentially for this throuple, whether or not you want to be. And I think there's such a deftness in that I really admire. So it's incredible to see him working from this, like, broad, easy perspective early on. I don't think Sally Meyer is supposed to be an archetype necessarily, but I think he's funny because we know guys who are sex pests and guys who are opportunists or are louches or anything like that, and we are supposed to kind of reflect that character onto our lived society. Whereas by later on, we can really indulge in characters that do feel like generated for entertainment that are not perhaps wholly representative of any particular aspect of society. I think that's just something I admire in filmmaking in general, is not being told that this is necessarily a reflection of life now or relationships now or philosophy now, but allowing me to draw what I want based on hyper specific characterization and plotting.
His films aren't prescriptive in that way, and they're not moralizing, they're not judgmental of basically anyone except the Nazis. And I think that also leads us to a film like MEYER from Berlin, where he is not judgmental of a character who is kind of intolerable to be around.
Totally.
So there's a bit of a tension there for me where I admire the lack of judgment, but I'm also like, do we really need to spend an hour not judging this guy?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it'd be maybe a little more fun if he, like, got what was coming for him at the end, but comeuppance with these characters is actually never as enjoyable as, like, watching them get away with it. It's kind of like a Roadrunner, Looney Tunes kind of thing, where it's like, we want these guys to get away. They're little stinkers. What's the fun if they get caught or reprimanded or any of that?
I think that this little stinker archetype, though, would be better played by other people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Ozzy Osbourne is such a good little stinker. She is amazing. I also think it's worth noting, too, how young he was when he made this. He was, I believe, 26 at the time, maybe even 25. And as Will in the first episode said, he doesn't look a day over 40.
I was going to very generously guess like 35 or 36.
It's weird thinking that the person I'm seeing on screen is like measurably younger than myself.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, they didn't have like retinol, hyaluronic acid back then. So it's not his fault.
It is interesting, though, because at this point, Anna Lubitsch had recently died, which is Ernst Lubitsch's mother. And Simon Lubitsch kind of became Ernst's responsibility. And at this point, Ernst was supporting his entire extended family, sister, brothers, father, with his work. And so he was in this this is one of the most stressful, nerve-wracking times of his whole life, right? It's right after the Great War had ended, and there was immense impoverishment everywhere. So kind of Lubitsch was the one, or Ernst in this context, was the one with the finger in the dam of his whole family's survival. Putting kind of like such a jaunty bourgeois film in that context. The gap between the character that he plays here and who the real person was, kind of working still basically 2 jobs and making a half dozen films a year to make ends meet.
I mean, it's really incredible. And it's hard to come to terms with how incredible making something like this was for the time being, with also how poorly it's staged and also just not great that it is. But, congrats to anyone who wrote a book, etc.
Yeah, you do got to hand it to Ernst.
Mm-hmm.
So, Fran, is there any place that our listeners can find your work? Anything you'd like to plug? Have at it.
Yeah, I'd always like to plug the amazing work that happens at Bright Wall Dark Room, where I sometimes write and sometimes I edit, but most of the time I'm just reading a lot of amazing essays on film. And then I'll also plug, I have a Substack called Fran Magazine, where we're just always having a nice time on there, and it'll be a year old by the time this airs, which is exciting, and I'm looking forward to what's to come with that project as well.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Next week, it's our season finale, and Bram Ruiter joins us to discuss The Oyster Princess. Head over to www.ernstcast.com for the links to the various public domain films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast service you happen to use. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.